contemplate how you have wonderfully made us and how you want to redeem and sanctify us. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, first of all, it's good to be back. It was a working vacation. So New Zealand, we had 2 camp meetings. There was about 160 people at each camp. One was a little bit more of a family camp, and that was on the North Island, and then the South Island. We had quite a few people who are non-Adventists, actually. And part of that is there's a ministry called First Light, and it's like a regional 3ABN, but it's different than 3ABN. I mean, it's independent of that. It's an independent ministry, so to speak, that would have things things from the Hope Channel, but then they air many of their own programs. So the whole series we would have had would eventually get on First Light once all the editing and everything's done. And they're really a really neat ministry. And so it was neat to see that. Doug Hurley, who's the ministry that invited me there, Autumn Leaves, they've been in a ministry for about 30-some years. And he had only been an Adventist for about 4 years when the Lord kind of led him to go from being an auto mechanics and starting really a publishing ministry and bringing in speakers and so forth. And he's very pastoral in his approach, just going around the islands and so forth. But they're just a real blessing. And they want to build a studio, and then wanted me to kind of come back maybe next year and do a verse by verse through Revelation and be on a video, and then, which I think would be really something I would love to do. And okay, somebody carry the luggage up. Yes.
What cities? Near what cities were the camp meetings?
In the North Island, I don't remember right now, but the South Island was Christchurch.
Okay.
Rangiora was in the North Island. So it's a beautiful country when you drive through there. It's just absolutely gorgeous. The only thing different than here is just driving on the other side of the road, pretty much. So, and then in Australia, we started in Melbourne, which is on the south part of that continent, on the east coast. Went from there having meetings up to the next weekend up in Sydney, and then the last weekend was up in Melbourne. So, but we had really good crowds there as well. The thing that was really buzzing around a lot of these camps was about David Gates, who has had a lot to do with some of the work in Australia. And a lot of people kind of sided with him with this idea something's going to happen this spring in a prophetic sense, like setting some dates. And unfortunately, he hasn't come out and corrected those views, but maybe he still believes them, But it's been a little divisive over there because you got people in the Gates camp and people not in the Gates camp. And those things, we always got to be careful. I mean, he's really, I don't know how many people he consulted with, but there's a lot of big name people who've written things as a rebuttal to that. And when you go that public and you're that well known, you've got to be all the more careful about what you say. But anyway, some of that was buzzing around, but it didn't really affect our meetings. People still were interested in, whoever the speaker was. So, but yeah, those were, it was a blessing to meet brothers and sisters there. And the theme was, mostly mental health. There's some sermons that were just pretty much mental health, but he tried to steer everything in that direction. And I kind of want to, the next couple Sabbaths here, continue to focus on that. And I just want to give you maybe an introduction to next week. And if you open your Bible, because this will be kind of a, yes?
I was wondering, these ministries that you're speaking about, are they worldwide? Is this something we can get on the internet?
If you want to, Autumn Leaves would have a bookstore. And they would have had different speakers, and I would assume on their website they would have these sermons from different speakers. Oh, and that's what I wanted to say. We had some non-Adventists in Christchurch because First Light, which doesn't air in Australia, but it's from New Zealand, was running a series I had done on the book of Romans about 4 years ago in Australia. And so while the meetings were going on in the North Island, they were running this series I was doing on Romans, and some people in the South Island were watching it and actually came to the meetings. One of the guys was, he wasn't the ambassador, but he was
a diplomat representing Australia or representing New Zealand at the EU, European Union. So, and he came, and boy, he was gobbling it all up. It was amazing. Without a doubt, these guys that had come that were non-Adventists definitely are going to Adventist churches. I'd be shocked if they didn't become Adventists. So
these guys were non-Adventists coming to your meeting?
Yeah, because they saw the Romans thing from First Light, and they were advertising the meetings for autumn leaves. So they worked well together. So there are people walking into Adventist churches just simply watching First Light. They're watching Doug Batchelor or what's the other guy? Amazing Discoveries. Walter Veith. There's people watching Walter Veith, and of course they're just hearing truth, and it's refreshing to them, and they just wind up going visit an Adventist church. And unfortunately, like with almost all self-supporting ministries, the conference isn't too favorable to them, even while they're bringing all these people to the church. So the ministry I worked with in Australia is Steps to Life Australia. It's not actually connected to Steps to Life US. It's a completely different ministry and so forth. And but they've been in ministry for, 20 plus years. A lady named Cheryl Martin and her husband started it, but he's passed away. He passed away, I'm kind of guessing, back around 2010 or somewhere in there. But they started a health retreat, which is how Wehr has now inherited over there. They actually built the facility. And then they've run a studio and did publishing and so forth. They're very active. They had this guy who was an evangelist, but again, they were independent. And they had a guy he's passed away, but he passed away early, like 30, 35. And I don't remember his name, but they would sponsor these meetings in like Sydney, and they'd have 300 people coming, this evangelistic series. And a conference wouldn't work with them. And I says, man, if I was a pastor in Australia, I'd say, you just run this series all you want, I mean, could you imagine that blessing? Having hundreds of people come to a meeting and you didn't have to pay for it. There's self-supporting ministries doing it. Mark Woodman is the evangelist. So if you get on Steps to Life Australia, they'll no doubt have an archive of, and maybe they have this Mark Woodman. I've never listened to him, so but maybe it's archived. So it's probably a good resource. So yeah, it's amazing how independent ministries per dollar are doing so much more work. And in their efforts. If it wasn't for self-supporting work, we just wouldn't hardly be putting a dent in this world. Almost all the literature goes to Africa is from self-supporting ministries. Almost all of it. You look at ministries like Cornerstone Publishing's gotten out 2 billion pieces of literature. You look at Ron Goss, it's in the tens of millions. And those are just 2 ministries. You think of all the other ones God has raised up over the years, and but anyway. So I want us to look at this scripture. This is kind of lays the groundwork of a concept, and I want to explore it a little bit more. And but I think there's something here in Matthew chapter 5, verse 37. Jesus said, "Let your communication be yea, yea, nay, nay. For whatever is more than these cometh of evil." And I understand that to be, I've always kind of understood that to be in the concept of an oath. You just tell the truth, right? But what if it really was more of a principle that how many options are there for you to make a decision?
2.
There's really just 2. Really, there's right and wrong. Can it really be that simple? And it's based on the light that you have. There is positive and negative. There's those on the right and those on the sheep and the goats, and then there's gain and there's loss. There's things that are health promoting and things that are health destroying. I mean, can life really be that simple? And I want to kind of look at things from that approach, and of course, be able to make these kinds of decisions. Of course, Depends on how much light you have to make these right decisions. But this is, of course, why we should study every day, and God will guide us. I mean, if you're a searcher for truth, you'll learn these things. God will guide you to know how to take care of your body, take care of your mind, and all these different things, how to do. And so I want us to kind of keep that in mind as we're going through different topics. Okay? And then the other thing I kind of want to introduce here is kind of an intro, is that, everything begins in the cortex, in your brain. You got a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere, because there's two things there. But it all runs via electricity. So God creates Adam of the dust of the ground, and it's a lifeless body until what?
Breathes.
So he breathes into him the breath of life. So we can call that the spirit, or the mind starts working, right? There's something you can't quite grasp, or like matter. I mean, there's life now flowing through him. And if that spirit leaves, if there's no electricity, the body just dies. But again, when you think about the electricity, what do you have? Just two things.
Either it's on or off.
You have a positive or a negative, right? Okay, it sounds really simple, but I think there's something to it. And so, what causes the electricity? Now, this to me is very interesting, and it's your thoughts. Your thoughts create the electricity. Your thoughts create input, and that keeps your mind working, because if you have no electrical current anymore, you die. Right? But something's got to create the electricity. The brain doesn't create its own electricity. Something creates that. It's got to be your thoughts. So everything really does begin with our thoughts. And of course, that all flows down to the limbic system, which is interesting in itself, because that, for women it's a little larger, but it has to do more with where all the chemistry is now going to take place. So in your body, you've got electricity and you have chemistry. Okay? Now, depending on what kind of thoughts you have, will depend on what kind of chemistry is taking place. So we've talked about before, when you have loving thoughts and kind thoughts, you have things like oxytocin and serotonin and things like that. And if you have negative thoughts and anger and so forth, it's more like cortisol and things like that. And those are just different chemicals based on originally your thoughts. So everything really begins with the thoughts. So when you look at disease, and then of course this is part of what I'm trying to pull together, some sort of series that makes sense, right? And because in the context of health, all disease has a cause. And most therapies deal with the symptoms or the effects of the cause. But when you just think about what I just said here, all causes of disease begins with a thought, which makes our decisions, because the cells don't think. Cells don't have emotions. But we do think up here. And the brain controls everything that happens down here. And all the cells, everything down below is connected up here. So it all starts here. So, and then the other thing was, and I'll try to put together a chart here, but you got the law of life, and there's, let's just say, two parts to it basically. You got a body, and you have a mind, or we call the spirit, or the breath that God breathed, and the mind starts working, right? Creates this electricity. And with the body, if we abide by the 8 laws of health, right? And with the mind, we're obeying the 10 commandments. It's all health promoting, isn't it?
Yes.
And as soon as you veer off either way, with any one of those laws, what happens? You're predisposed to disease. I mean, you're likely to get sick, whether it's a mental illness or a physical illness. I mean, it's really that simple, isn't it? And so when you start thinking about, wow, how could we pull together a whole message? I mean, we do have messages on physical health, the 8 laws, but really, if we could just get something that ties all the mental health principles together and say, these are the laws of life. And it's really just simply that simple. your body needs the 8 laws, and your mind needs these 10 commandments, which teaches these kinds of principles of how to think. Right? Because Jesus would even says, when the question was at the great law, well, love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and your neighbor as yourself, right? You had a question? Thought?
Something I just read this week in one of my devotion books about how the 8 laws of health, the health laws are equal to the 10 commandment laws. So if you break the laws of health, you've broken the 10 commandments.
Sure, okay. No, I would agree with that.
And so that just came to mind when we were talking about them going together.
Yeah. So, anyway, I'm kind of excited about looking more into that next week. Okay? But just the idea, 2 things. So, this morning I had said I would talk about attachment. Of course, it has to do with bonding and so forth. So as a result of the attachment relationship between a mother and a child, the baby forms an internal working model of the mother, in a sense, because that's what the child knows, or whoever is the main caregiver, right? And the brain spurts in the 3rd trimester through the 2nd year. So this is where you're going to see the fastest, greatest amount of growth to the brain, is this. I mean, we continue, and the brain continues to be malleable, change, epigenetics and neuroplasticity. Our mind can change, the brain can change towards good or bad throughout life. But where you see the greatest amount of change and growth is that 3rd trimester and the first 2 years of life. This becomes a real critical period of time. And during these first 2 years, the attachment mechanism is doing more than just affecting the psychology of the developing child. It's impacting the brain circuits. So, when we know that even as adults, if we have more positive thinking, it's starting to change the circuitry. It's creating new pathways of behavior and thought. Well, imagine what's now happening to this baby who's beginning all this fresh. Imagine the circuitry that's developing through the mother, the main caregiver, by how she is being attached to this baby. And this baby's trying to mimic and have that same circuitry. So you start thinking about how important it is, even as mothers, adults, or you're having children, how important it is to have right thinking and right behavior and things like that. Because that's how you're going to give your expressions to your baby. They hear the tone of your voice and things like that. So the baby's not just learning, some psychology or whatever's going through the baby's mind. It's actually physiologically forming the circuitry in the brain. Okay? So through picking up bodily-based nonverbal communication, especially things like facial expressions and the tone of the mother's voice, the way the baby's touched or caressed or whatever, the mother's helping to develop the baby's, first and foremost, the right brain, the right side of the brain. So we're really developing more the right side before the left side. The left side is what we'd have more to do with cognitive things. So the little the 1-year-old or the 3-month-old is not doing a lot of critical thinking right now. But it's certainly reacting to attachment and feeling and emotions and things like that. So the right brain is dominant for attachment, for things like how you get to deal with stress and things like that in life. So basically where this message is going to go is that people who experience post-traumatic stress disorder may have had a less attachment early in life, so that they're not able to deal with stress and things as well throughout life. But of course, since the mind is always malleable, we can have other significant people come in our life later on in life. If we were deprived of that attachment early, if there's someone in our life that gives us that time and that support later in life, we can move towards being able to handle stress better. Okay? So during these 2 years, the mother's helping the baby to regulate emotions, tolerate emotions, whether they're positive or negative. So the baby is just simply learning this stuff by its attachment to its mother. It experiences some sort of outside influence. It's either seems negative or positive to the baby, and the mother there is helping the baby learn how to cope with. Okay? It's helping the child have resilience. so that as it gets older, it's able to handle stressful situations better. Okay? So if there's an enormous stress during this time, then developmental trajectories are altered, especially the limbic system of the right brain and the emotion processing circuits there. So, even as we're sitting here now and throughout the week, our brain has changed somewhat, depending on what's happened to us. But imagine for a baby the brain's really growing these first couple years. And as we mentioned, the right hemisphere develops before the left hemisphere. And at 2 to 3 months, the posterior areas of the right hemisphere now become mature, and the baby is now able to read the mother's face. And you think about how God designed us that way. God is actually helping us learn more about emotion and love and those kinds of feelings through the limbic system on the right side before we learn language and cognitive skills and know how to count and spell and read. And the mother is only able to spend about 30% of her time during this time because she cooks and cleans, she does this and that. She's not 100% with the baby during all waking hours. But 30%, so you maximize that 30% of that time that you're with the baby to make sure that you're able to have that kind of attachment with them and you're helping them deal with these different positive or negative influences, okay? So if we look at attachment and use a different word, use attunement. You're in tune with your child. You can have on the one side a secure attunement or attachment, and then an insecure attunement or attachment, right? There's two things, right? It all sounds very simple, doesn't it? And if it's insecure, if the baby goes through enough negative things and these things aren't addressed and it goes for long periods of time, they're more predisposed to post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay? They are more, it's a precursor to borderline personality disorder. It's associated with dissociative states where a person might kind of grow up, and some people just have they see something happen, just have kind of a blank stare, and everybody else thinks it's funny or sad or whatever, and this person seems to be kind of disassociated with it. And so when a person grows up with that disattachment over prolonged time, they seem to fall in that kind of camp as they grow up. But again, the mind is malleable, and things can always be improved, right? So we have secure attachment or attunement, insecure attunement or attachment. And so there's three things I want to mention now. One is attunement. You're in tune with the child or with the baby. And then somehow there's this misattunement. You think, why is the baby crying? You may not know because the baby can't tell you, right? So there's this misattunement. And so you have attunement and misattunement as you're trying to look at your own baby's woos and facial expressions and the crying and these things. And so you're trying to be attached and attuned there, and that's what they call reattunement. You try to bring that child back to a positive or a security. So you have this attunement, this attachment, and all of a sudden something happens. So when we were having lunch, I think it was my last Sabbath here, and the baby right there looked at me and he just started crying, right? Okay, you remember that? I won't forget that. And so that was a misattunement, okay? And Mom had to figure out a way to bring the baby back to a reattunement or a reattachment, okay? Because she didn't want the baby to just sit there and look at me for an hour, right, and just cry. That would be traumatic, right? So she had to do something to bring the baby back to having peace, okay? So good enough caregiving is down-regulating negative effects. So you're actually helping the baby to, when it experiences something, not to overreact to something, okay? And they're learning this all really on before there's any real cognitive skills, right? They're building resilience emotionally and so forth. Because when we look at stress, we're not just cognitive when we deal with emotions and things. There's a resilience in us to deal with stuff. There's a combination there. And then she's also upregulating the positive effects, that when there's something joyous, and experience that joy, but not to the point, oh, thank you, yeah. To the point that gets out of balance the other way, right? So what this does is it builds resilience of the ability to shift from a positive to a negative and back to a positive. And so when you think about living in a fallen world, your day could start off nice, and then you go through the day and all of a sudden there's this negative, and wouldn't it be good that in a cognitive and an emotional way, you can get right back to positive as fast as possible and as healthy as possible, okay? And not be extremes. If the baby experiences a stress response for an extended time because of the lack of repair, and that would be the other word instead of reattunement, reattachment, is just the idea of repair. This could bathe the brain in hormones like cortisol or glutamate that could have a negative effect. So the thing is, there's electricity here, and all that electricity in thoughts and emotions creates chemicals. It's just the way we work, and the negative produces more negative chemicals. And so when you have attunement with your child and then there's this misattunement, there's some stressful thing, it is important to get the baby back to peace and so forth, because you don't want an excess of the bad chemicals, bathing the cells in that. So resilience is an outcome of a good enough caregiver and a child with a good attachment bond. And so when you got a baby and you're raising your children, you want to be a good care provider to help your children build resilience, okay? And that's building a bond with your child. Babies are not born resilient. We're just kind of born innocent in a way. I mean, but malleable. And resilience is the ability to shift our states depending upon changes in the external context out there. So we've talked about attachment or attunement, misattunement, and reattunement or repair. You're trying to repair your child's situation there. Okay? So when you just think about that in basic life, isn't that the way we should be working anyway? I mean, if someone's enjoying this and then they're going through this, you're trying to engage and help bring repair, right? Help people get right back to that peace. So when we think about repair, what a mother might do, and of course the majority out there, I mean, you would know more than myself here, but mother's attuning to the rhythms of the baby's automatic nervous system. She's matching the rhythms of the involuntary nervous system of the baby. So the baby's voice, the cry, the gestures, the facial expressions, these are all expressions of an internal rhythm going through the baby. And the mother is trying to match and trying to empathize, be with that child, and create that bonding and help bring that child back, and there's repair and there's safety and there's security. Okay? So what the baby is learning initially is the vocabulary of nonverbal communication. The baby actually is learning a vocabulary, but it's not words, it's not letters, it's all the expressions you have. Okay? Touch, everything. And a mother who's depressed or more in an excessive way may have problems picking up these rhythms of the child. Because she's so depressed, she may not pick up on these cues of the baby's expression and tone and things, okay? And so this is why, depression seminars and things like that, especially people who have children, because it's going to influence the child, because during these years it's going to influence how the circuitry's going to be put together. So the first 2 years is the plastic period where the things are mostly growing and so forth. when the baby's more sensitive to negative influences and positive influences, the most at that time. But there is continued neuroplasticity where we know that even if you start off a little rougher, a significant other kind of person can come in your life. And this, of course, is the value of faith in God. Because, there can be people who are high, they get really high on a positive and very low negative, and they're not in this range where a lot of people feel comfortable working with a person like that. They're either way up here or they're way down here. But God takes us just as we are, where a lot of society doesn't. And so this is where making sure that our faith is not just faith in a church, or our faith is not just faith in a set of doctrines, but our faith is actually in a personal relationship with God who will take you with the highs and the lows and trying to bring you back. So the concepts of prayer and study and thinking about God become all the more important. And I think we do a little bit of an injustice when we bring people in the church and our whole focus is so doctrinal that we equate doctrine with faith. But is it the kind of faith that's going to get people through the highs and lows of life? And this is where we need to think in terms that, yes, there's doctrines that have to do with the faith, but there's also faith in God and a relationship with God that needs to be equally addressed, knowing that you never know how a person was brought up. You don't know their ability to go through the stresses of life. And if they have that hold on God, what a difference that makes, right? What a difference that makes. So the HPA, the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal, they call that the axis, the APA axis, is involved in regulating sympathetic and parasympathetic states of arousal. This is your stress regulation arousal system. And it's sitting on top of the HPA axis is the limbic system, which is where, of course, this is what's being developed first as a child, right? This limbic system, this idea of dealing with more of the emotional state. And so sitting on top of this limbic system is this, or sitting on top of the HPA axis is the limbic system, especially in the right hemisphere. So the HPA axis is connected more to the right brain than to the left. And when it comes to regulation, the highest levels of regulation is in the frontal areas of the right brain, especially the orbital frontal cortex, the OFC. And the OFC connected to the anterior cingulate connects into the into the fear centers. Huh? Amygdala. Did I say that? No? Oh. Okay. What did I say here? Oh, I did. I put an N there. Amygdala. So the fear centers are the amygdala and the insula, and then down right into the HPA axis. So, so this vertical circuit allows us to regulate stress. So if these things develop healthfully at the beginning, right? If there's this attachment and there's this security in the limbic system, then you're going to have better connections down to the part of the brain that has to deal with how you handle fear and anxiety. So if it's compromised up above, then that connection's not as good there, so that the idea of post-traumatic stress is enhanced. Okay? But negatives aren't always bad, are they? We almost need some, because in one way that's how we build some resilience. So we live in a fallen world where the baby's going to go through some stress, but the idea that the mother's there to help the baby get repair and bring it back, they grow up knowing that even if stress happens, they can get through it successfully. That's really what's important there. But if it's a prolonged negativity, right, it's going to have an overall negative effect. So if we were at Nathan was only about 5, and we went to someone's house, and they said, oh, there's this little, what was it? It's like a, I don't know if I want to call it might have been kind of a movie thing, but anyway, it was about some kids. And they said, oh, this is really, really good. So we said, I don't know. So anyway, we watched it for a while, and this little kid did something, and I don't know if he stole something or said something that wasn't true. And Nathan got so upset, he said, oh, that's so wrong. That's so wrong. He even stood up and he says, that's so wrong. And that was just the appropriate response. He saw something negative, and he protested it. So when you see a negative and you protest it, does it make you stronger or weaker? Stronger. We didn't want him to watch it anymore, right? And I said, that's it. We don't watch any more of this. But the thing is that we had no idea that scene was going to come, right? And so, but we were so pleased with his response because he was able to protest something that he saw that was wrong. And ultimately, that's how you have to handle the negativity that you see around you, and that can actually make you stronger. Okay. So when I think about how important it is, this development of the first 2 years of the brain, and then I start thinking about maybe why God chose Mary. Mary wasn't a theologian, probably. She probably knew her Bible. But she might have been the best young lady out of the tribe of Judah that had a way of always making Jesus feel secure. Does that make sense? Because throughout the entire life of Jesus, and of course he was born of the Holy Spirit, I understand that, but there's that mothering effect that Mary had that allowed Jesus in every stressful situation, and I'm not trying to give her the credit, but God chose her. I mean, there's a real human relationship there that always allowed Jesus to go through the stress 100% the right way, which was more than cognitive, it was emotional, right? And I do want to look at some of these verses here. Isaiah 49, let's begin with Isaiah 49. 13, Isaiah 49:13. And it says, sing, O heavens, and be joyful, O earth, and break forth into singing, O mountains, for the Lord hath comforted his people, and will have mercy upon his afflicted. In Isaiah 49:13. God is the combination, the perfect blend of both mercy and justice. And when I think of justice, I think more of accountability, and I think in terms of maybe things a little bit more cognitive about what you should know and things you ought to be choosing to do. But there's always this mercy. And so now I'm starting to look at mercy a little different. It says, is this God's way of not just telling us what's right, but he mixes it all with mercy to make us get back into the repair of feeling secure again. Does this make sense? Because this is the way we were made. And so when I start thinking about how our brain developed, where we're learning more security than we're learning cognitive things, wouldn't it make sense that that's how God deals with us? That he's trying to get us to make all the right decisions, but along the way, we've got to be able to have a relationship that when we get off the path, there's someone there that gets reattuned with us to bring us back, no matter if we're high or low. And God's going to be the perfect parent, isn't he? So let's look at Colossians 3:12. Colossians chapter 3, verse 12. Put on, therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, bowels of mercy, kindness, humbleness of mind, meekness, and long-suffering. It goes on and says, forbearing one another, forgiving one another. If any man have a quarrel against any, even as Christ forgave you, so also do ye. And it's not a verse about things that are cognitive. It's not about, what's the truth about the Sabbath or what happens when a person dies. And all these things are very important. But there's this other side that even when we're in the church, and so often, when you think of a Bible study, did this verse ever come up in your Bible study? Colossians 3:12. That part of being a Christian isn't just having right doctrine. It's about being merciful and about being forgiving and having meekness and lowliness of mind. And it's like, well, that's kind of who we are. Whereas there's a limbic system and there's the left brain that's more cognitive and the right brain that deals more with our emotional state and so forth. And we need to almost address these things equally, really, to be balanced. Let's go back to Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, chapter 54 and verse 10. (54 and verse 10). For the mountains shall depart and the hills be removed, but my kindness shall not depart from thee, neither shall the covenant of my peace be removed, saith the Lord that hath mercy on thee. So when everything's what? Absolutely fallen apart, there's reattachment here. He's going to be merciful to us. And again, it's not a verse that's speaking to us cognitively. And when everything's bad, just do this. Okay? But just know that I'm with you. Okay? Just know that I'm with you. And when you start thinking about in the end of time, when the whole world's arrayed against us, it's not really just enough for us just to know the right cognitive things. It's going to be knowing how merciful and loving kind, how God is so lovingly kind to us and is going to take care of us. And that reassurance that He'll give us that we're His people, even though humanity has called us the enemies of the state. So let's look at Psalm 116. 116 verse 5. The Lord preserveth the simple. Let's see, no, is that right? 116 verse 5. Oh, gracious is the Lord, and righteous, yea, our God is merciful. The Lord preserveth the simple. I was brought low, and He helped me. And so we're going to find throughout Scripture, not just God being a God who teaches the Ten Commandments or teaches doctrine, but again, there's that relational side. Psalm 119, verse 77. Let thy tender mercies come unto me, that I may live, for thy law is my delight. And that's a kind of a neat verse because it brings both thoughts together. There's a cognitive side to this verse. For thy law is my delight. But what seems to come first, let thy tender mercies come unto me, that I may live, for thy law is my delight. Knowing how merciful, is that a cough drop? I got one right here. All those really go together. 2 Corinthians chapter 1. Verses 3 and 4. Blessed be God, even the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and of the God of all comfort, who comforteth us in all our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort them which are in any trouble, by the comfort wherewith we ourselves are comforted of God. So when you think about attachment, but then there's this misattachment, we're into a stressful situation. And there needs to be reattachment, where we find that mercy and so forth, or the mother helps the child. This is exactly what this verse is saying. Who comforts all in our tribulation. So we go through tribulation, and God knows that we don't just need a right answer, we need comfort. Okay? It's how we were designed, it's how we originally, how our brains developed. So let's look at Philippians. Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. If there be therefore any consolation in Christ, if any comfort of love, if any fellowship of the Spirit, if any bowels and mercies, fulfill ye my joy, that ye may be like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind, that nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem other better than themselves. And then in Matthew, okay, thank you. And then in Matthew, so I think it's, I've only picked out quite a few verses here, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. And I started looking at this, how the baby grows up and you just develop the right side. It's like, oh, well, it just opened up the Bible. It's like, I hadn't seen how merciful, how many verses deal with mercy and comfort before. It's almost like there almost seems to be more of that than there is of instruction. I find it very interesting. And had never seen that before. Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. If there is oh, I already did that, didn't I? So, that's going to my brain here. Okay, Matthew chapter 9. Beginning with verse 35. And Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel of the kingdom. So that's all cognitive. Healing every sickness and every disease among the people. And that kind of falls a little bit into the comfort zone, doesn't it? But when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion on them, because they fainted and were scattered abroad, as sheep having no shepherd. Then said he unto his disciples, the harvest truly is plenteous, but the laborers are few. Pray ye therefore the Lord of the harvest, and he will send forth laborers into his harvest. Okay, Psalm 103. And I don't know if anyone's ever done a study on how many compassion verses there are in the Bible, but Psalm 103, verses 1 through 5. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits, who forgiveth all thy iniquities, who healeth all thy diseases, who redeemeth thy life from destruction, who crowneth thee with loving kindness and tender mercies, who satisfieth thy mouth with good things, so that thy youth is renewed like the eagles. Okay. And then the last two, back in the book of Matthew, chapter 20. Chapter 20, verses 29 through 34. And as they departed from Jericho, a great multitude followed him, and behold, two blind men sitting by the wayside. When they heard that Jesus passed by, and cried out, saying, Have mercy on us, O Lord, thou Son of David. And the multitude rebuked them, because they should not hold their peace, or that they should hold their peace. But they cried the more, saying, Have mercy on us, O Lord, thou Son of David. And Jesus stood still and called them and said, What would ye have that I should do unto you? And they said unto him, Lord, that our eyes may be opened. So Jesus had compassion on them, touched their eyes, and immediately their eyes received sight, and they followed him. That was Matthew chapter 20, beginning with verse 29. And the last one here, and of course this is again just scratching the surface, of Matthew chapter 15, beginning with verse 29. And Jesus departed from thence and came nigh unto the Sea of Galilee, and went up into a mountain and sat down. And a great multitude came unto him, having them with those that were lame, blind, dumb, maimed, and many others, and cast them down at Jesus' feet. And he healed them all. He healed them. Insomuch as the multitude wondered when they saw the dumb to speak, the maimed to be whole, and the lame to walk, and the blind to see. And they glorified the God of Israel. And then in the next section, through the rest of the chapter, Jesus feeds the 4,000. So in finishing up this one, I guess we are running out of time here. If a person starts off with an insecure attachment, one can have what they call earned secure attachment. An earned secure attachment isn't that you earned anything, it's just that you earned it via that you had another significant person come in your life, a friend, a fellow Christian or something. And so you were deprived that as a child, which you had no say over. But you now, later in life, you had an earned one. You yourself engaged in a developing friendship and of support with someone else. And that does become important, doesn't it? So when it comes to post-traumatic stress disorder, they say it could be from misattachment, from severe dysregulation or negative or neglect over such long periods of time. And here's kind of the neurobiology of it. They say the orbital frontal cortex is extremely problematic. It is less connected. It is literally smaller and has less of an impact of the right amygdala, which is the major fear system in the brain. So when people go through post-traumatic stress, there is a neurobiology to it. And so when they can look at that and say, okay, why isn't this connected as well? Why is there this thinner layers and so forth? And some of them are saying that could go back to the early years of disattachment or misattachment. And then going through some stressful thing, they just simply didn't have enough reserve. They didn't have enough resiliency to go through being a soldier out in Afghanistan. And I mean, when you look at the 20,000 soldiers in Afghanistan or Iraq, you know X amount of those had misattachment in those first 2 years. And I don't know what the statistics are if anybody's ever done that, but at least there's a neurobiology here. And it says there is a thinning down of the connections between the orbital frontal and the amygdala, which are the regulatory circuits for, of course, our way of responding to fear and stress. So there is a science, there is a physiology to why people don't go through it as well, and a lot of it may just be those early years. So when you start thinking about, again, how God made us, where there's the cognitive part, and we live in a culture where everything is so cognitive, even in the church. The emphasis seems to be predominantly cognitive. And there's a part to all that. I mean, we need to know what is truth.